This is why I highly recommend learning a foreign language. You have a lot of fun. You get to know the people much better. When you eat food, when you eat sushi, and you actually learn the words to describe the actual flavors and tastes that you're experiencing. One was the fish I was eating had a little bit too much wasabi. I could feel it in my nose, and the sushi master looked at me and said, "Kimashita." And I learned right there in that moment that means like you really got the full brunt of the wasabi. So the next time I was able to use it, when I had a little bit too much wasabi on my sushi and my eyes watered, I looked around and said, "Kimashita." And everybody started laughing. So eating food, saying like, "Wow, that's spicy. Yeah, that's great." But if you can describe the food and connect with people on that level, that's just one benefit of learning a foreign language. Another is there's so many different nuances to a language like Japanese. You learn the culture a lot better, because when you learn little bits of language in Japan, there are certain things that are maybe from a Chinese proverb or maybe a really old story in Japan. And so when people pull out an expression that's, probably comes from a story from 1,000 years ago, like in the States, we say you give an inch, they take a mile. If people are not familiar with miles, and I give my American fans a hard time because often I'll say it's 35 degrees here in Tokyo, and immediately the comment is, "What's that in Fahrenheit?" And I just want to say, hey, just look it up. Now check this out. I found a beetle. It might be a cicada, but it has sadly moved on to the next world. But it's on this precarious little perch here. Let's check it out. I don't think that's a cicada. It doesn't look like a cicada, and it's a little bit early for this guy to be moving on to the next world. But I find the placement kind of strange. Usually you'll find them in the leaves or, down there somewhere. But this is a little strange. Maybe somebody put it there. But I was saying, I give my American friends a really hard time because when I say something is, 100 kilometers away, the first question is, how many miles is that? Or it's 35 degrees in Tokyo. They say, "Oh, you must be freezing." No, that's too hot, especially with the humidity. But I give my American friends a hard time because they'll usually ask me to convert the temperatures or distances for them. And you can easily do that with a Google search. I'm not a mathematician, really not good at converting things in my head. I just know that 100 kilometers is far. I know that basically 30 degrees Celsius is hot, and it goes up exponentially. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit is freezing temperature, the temperature at which water freezes. Now, if you go from 32 to 31, yeah, it's cold, but you don't really feel the difference. In Celsius, if you go from 30 degrees Celsius to 31 degrees or 32 degrees Celsius, you feel a difference. And 35 degrees is sweltering. And I know a lot of other places are getting, 37, 40, etc. So it's not as hot as other places, but it's all relative. When you're used to, 27 degrees, then 35 is just too hot. We just had an example of how people behave in cities in Japan. I really prefer the country sometimes because people are much more polite. They'll say good morning. Instead, this guy had somewhere to go, and he just not so subtly pushed his way by instead of saying excuse me or something. But that's just people in a big city. I was driving in a small town one time and pulled up to a 7-Eleven, and a car sped past me, went around me, slammed on the brakes, went into a parking spot. And I looked, and they had a Tokyo license plate. And I just thought, yeah, that's how people behave in Tokyo. Everything's a race. Everything's a race. You got to get there before everybody else because there's a constant feeling of lacking because they lack space, they lack time. People in the country have a lot more relaxed attitude there, and it allows them to be a lot more polite. In Tokyo, people think nothing of. If you're standing in a supermarket, and I'm going down some stairs, so I got to pay attention. In Tokyo, in a supermarket, people think nothing of just bashing into you with their shopping cart. And I don't know if it's intentional or not. Sometimes it kind of feels like it's intentional, but people in Tokyo just have, they're so used to not having space that bumping into people and almost running people over, they don't even give it a second thought. The issue you get with being in the country is you live under a microscope. I told the story before about how I took a PCR test and then visited some friends in the country. I had told my friends before I visited, here, I got a PCR test, here are my results, it's negative, I'm totally safe. They were fine. When I got there, and like I said, I was walking around and I went to get a water at a store, and one of the people looked at me and said, is this foreigner safe to be around? Foreigners bring diseases, Japanese don't bring diseases. And somebody walked over and said, oh, don't worry, he's had a PCR test and it was negative. And I didn't know this person. I looked over like, who are you? I don't know who you are, but you know a lot about me. And then they continued to discuss. And what I realized is when you're in a small town, you're living under a microscope. And this is probably one reason I resist moving to the country, even though the rent is much cheaper. You know, you get more fresh air, you get more sunshine. But I don't like living under a microscope. I just don't. I like my anonymity. So I like the big city. You know what they say, if you want to be alone in Tokyo, go to a crowded place. So that's my rant for the day, but I don't think I'm going to get a video about coffee. This video, by the way. Don't think I'm going to get that video done today because of the background noise from the cicadas. In Tokyo, I'm going to make another video about this, but in Tokyo, it's really hard to film. People always ask me why I film in my tiny apartment in front of a green screen. And the truth is, I don't always want to film in a tiny apartment in front of a green screen and then use special effects to put in a fancy background. Sometimes the background is me. And somebody told me they saw one of my videos and said there's too much Tracy in this video. That's fine. But people always ask me why I film in my small apartment in front of a green screen. And this is one reason. Other times you'll have background noise. If you go to a park, there's going to be a lot of children. There's going to be construction. Tokyo, construction is never finished. Tokyo will never be complete as a city. There will always be something. There will always be road construction. Always be kids yelling. You know, they're here at the park. They're here to play. So I can't complain too much. Intentionally get in the way. But, you know, they're going about their lives and they don't really care if they don't care if some YouTuber wants them to be quiet. You can't yell quiet on the set because as soon as you do, you know, you get a helicopter. Like right now, I don't know if you can hear that. Get a helicopter, you get the breeze. I've taken a lot of countermeasures to cut out the breeze. I tried to learn, you know, better software techniques to cut out these noises, but stuff like this, you just can't cut it out. There's always traffic, there's ambulances, but, and this is funny because I complain, but it's all relative. I complain that Tokyo can be noisy and I want to get out to the country and get some fresh air and eat some delicious seafood that was taken from the ocean that morning. But, and I complain though, even though it's so peaceful and quiet in the country, that you're under a microscope. And even though I complain that there's too much noise in Tokyo, it does offer a lot of anonymity and people leave you alone. I mean, people do say, oh, it's kind of sad that we live next to these people, we don't know our neighbors. And that's fine. I have my friends here in Tokyo. If I need something, I can reach out. I don't need to get involved in my neighbor's business. I don't need them involved in my business. So I kind of like to keep that distance. It's kind of nice. So this has been Arisugawa Park and my rant about privacy, about noise, the things I love and don't love about Japan. Especially if you visited Japan. A lot of people say, oh, it was so wonderful. The people are so nice. And, you know, it's so clean. You hear the mom say, the mom said, urusai. Now, they don't really have a word for shut up in Japan. They do have a word for, you know, you're being too loud, you're being too noisy. Urusai. Honestly, because people care so much about what everybody around them thinks that I don't think she was actually telling him to be quiet. I think she was just acknowledging that he was being noisy. It's not going to have any effect because I can still hear him screaming back there. But kids are kids, especially little kids. It's hot outside. I can imagine it's probably hungry, probably too hot. Probably wants to go home and take a nap. I'm working on another video about visiting versus moving to Japan. I'll put a link up here when it's done. Now, I've had a lot of people come over and say, wow, I had such a great time in Japan. It's so clean and so safe and people are so nice and polite. And that's all true. The funny thing is when you move here and you get into the work culture, you'll find out that people are not that nice. The funny thing is when you move here, you'll find out that the work culture is not, there's not a lot of work-life balance. And this is funny, the better your Japanese gets, the more people expect you to behave like a Japanese person. That means long hours, That means putting up with inefficient meetings that seem to go on forever and nothing gets decided. I talked about that in my video about business meetings. A lot of foreigners find out they have a lack of connection with their Japanese counterparts. Whoop. I have a good connection with the bugs, but a lot of foreigners find out they don't have a good connection with their Japanese counterparts. I heard a great explanation of this. A relative of mine moved to Europe in his early 20s and said he tried to make friends over there. He's been there 30 years now, and found out that the people around him were very closed off to making new friends. And at first he thought, well, they don't like me because I'm a foreigner. And then he found out later that the small European town he moved to was people had gone to the same nursery school, the same kindergarten, the same elementary, junior high school, same college. They had dated each other and then married each other in that small town. And so he found out that they weren't being closed off because he's a foreigner. He found out that they already had all their best friends. They had already filled their capacity or filled their need for best friends. So he found out as a foreigner in Europe. I found the same thing in Japan. Of course, I'm American, so I connect with Americans. Somebody from the West Coast, somebody from the East Coast of the United States, we don't have the same culture. Somebody from a large city or small town, we don't always have the same culture. I find Aussies very easy to connect with. And it doesn't really seem to matter what part of Australia they come from. They're just a fun group of people to hang around with. I get along with Brits, anybody from the UK, anybody from like Ireland, Scotland, England. I find more English. I do know a couple Irish people, but I get along with Canadians just great. I mean, we share a lot of the same culture, watched a lot of the same TV shows growing up. Americans, we call each other bro or buddy. So Australians call each other mate. So I find when I'm talking to my Australian friends, I'll call them mate and they call me bro. And we're both trying to compensate for like the different dialects of English. So when a Brit's talking to a Yank, they just say like American football or soccer, and it's pretty easy to adapt. People from the East Coast and West Coast of the US and Canada have more in common with each other than somebody from New York would have with somebody from a small town, or somebody from New York would have with somebody from Seattle or Los Angeles. The other difference I find is age differences. So if I'm 10 years older than somebody, and I grew up with different music, we'll have different things that we enjoyed. And I've been in Japan so long that I haven't watched a lot of American TV. So you heard me talk about Game of Thrones before, or Breaking Bad. I missed all that. I didn't see that on TV. I think I was in America when Breaking Bad finished and watched it on Netflix. And I think, I was in America part of the time when Game of Thrones was going on. And, but I hadn't watched it from the beginning. I missed most of it. So when my coworkers would talk about the latest episode of Game of Thrones, I was lost. I would just go get a coffee. Length of time overseas. So if you've been in a foreign country a long time, you'll find out that you've missed a lot of cultural references. And if you're not following politics, a lot of foreigners in Japan say they love being here because we don't get all the political news from home, especially if it's divisive. We're able to skip a lot of that. If we don't speak very good Japanese, we don't really get the Japanese news. It doesn't become stressful because you don't understand what's going on, and it's not a big deal. It was Eddie, the proprietor of Crack, Irish pub. I'll put a link up here to our podcast. He told me that when he started learning to speak and understand Japanese really well, he started to find out that Japan is not this big wonderland, that there's actual crime and there's poverty and there's things, good and bad things that happen. So he pulled back a little bit. For a lot of foreigners, it's better to live in this kind of amusement park of Japan where everything's cute, everything's kawaii, where people are so nice and they're always giving each other gifts, and you get to go out and drink anytime you want. But a lot of people, when they start to find out that Japan is just another country, they can get disillusioned. So I think one way to do it is move to another country where people can understand you in English, or if you have a spouse or a partner who speaks the language, that's very helpful. You don't want to rely on them too much because that becomes stressful for them. If their English is not that great, then a lot of things can get lost in translation. They're not your professional interpreter. Don't give them a hard time if something gets lost in translation. But if you're a native English speaker, you can find a place where people understand English and you can get by. You'll probably have a much better time than if you get too fluent in the local language, because when you start to get fluent, then people start to expect things of you. So as I got better at Japanese, people would say, your Japanese is pretty good, but the way you exchanged business cards was all wrong. You exchanged business cards with the wrong person first. They tended to get hypercritical and almost kind of micromanaging of my behavior. I find out that have a lot of customers who speak English very well. And when we conduct meetings in English, my Japanese colleagues would never say anything afterward. They're like, wow, your English is really good. Of course it is. I grew up speaking English. Yeah, the more fluent I get at Japanese, the more expectations are flung upon you, and the more criticism you can get for not being Japanese enough. There's kind of this honeymoon phase when you first move to Japan. You're not expected to speak Japanese. And if you make funny mistakes, then that's perfectly fine. The better you get, the more people expect of you. So a lot of people just avoid that by not learning Japanese. And I think they miss out a lot. I started this off by saying, when you learn another language, you learn how to describe, smells, sights, sounds, taste, feelings, especially feelings. Japan has a completely different vocabulary for feelings. And when you learn those things, you connect with people. You can connect with people on that level. I think you have a much richer experience. So yes, even though I just said, I've probably contradicted myself during this video, but even though I've said that when you start to learn the language better, people expect more of you, they can become more critical of you. But overall, I think you have a much richer experience if you learn the language. Peace.